Welcome, Spencer. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
You've spent years helping people think more clearly, not just in theory, but also in how they live. What first pulled you towards that mission?
I got really interested in this topic when I started realizing how many irrational thoughts I have. My entry point was actually cognitive behavioral therapy. I learned about this method of therapy, and one of the claims it makes is that when you're feeling emotional, your thoughts tend to be distorted. And so I took this as a little experiment to try. I wasn't sure if it was true. So one day when I was feeling upset, I wrote down my thoughts and then I returned to those thoughts later and I realized, wow, they really are distorted. At the time, it seemed like they were totally reasonable. But when I look back at the thoughts, I realized they were quite irrational. And this got me down this road of thinking, wow, I wonder what other ways my mind might be distorting my thinking or having irrational beliefs and so on. And so kind of that began my quest. And it's something that I've been passionately pursuing ever since.
What are the key factors that you think cause smart people to think or act irrationally?
Well, I think that sometimes we're not even trying to get at the truth. As an example, let's suppose you've been part of a group since childhood, and let's say the group has a bunch of false beliefs. By stopping to believe those beliefs, you might create a disconnect between yourself and the people that you love, and so you may not be truth seeking with regard to those beliefs, right? And this often happens in cults, but it can happen in all kinds of groups. So one thing is that we're not always truth seeking, and if you're a very smart person and you're not engaging in truth seeking, you might actually use that intelligence to rationalize very effectively. You might come up with very clever arguments about why your beliefs are actually correct when you're not even trying to figure out the truth. But the funny thing about the human mind is that it's not like we do this knowingly. We do this without realizing it. And so we're engaging often in rationalization or confirmation bias without being aware of it. So that's just one way in which these two things can not necessarily be related to each other.
Do you think thinking independently comes at a cost of with the social connections? And does it have anything to do with how our brains are wired in terms of evolution?
Well, thinking independently can certainly lead you to have unusual beliefs, and unusual beliefs can make other people feel less connected to you. And so there's a risk there. Of course, you don't always have to share your beliefs with other people, but even just having those beliefs, if others around you don't, can actually create less social connection. So, yeah, I think that is a risk of independent thinking. Of course, there's lots of benefits of independent thinking, right? You might come to believe things that are true and are helpful to you that other people don't believe. You might come up with new ideas that are helpful for society broadly. Um, and you might just value independent thinking for its own sake. So, not to say that there's not a lot of good stuff about it, but I do think there's some risk to it.
Do you think is intelligence alone enough to avoid irrational choices, or are there something else that we should also consider?
No, intelligence is definitely not enough to avoid irrational choices. First of all, I would say we have no hope of being perfectly rational. That's a goal that no human will ever achieve. That doesn't mean it's not worth striving towards because we can become more and more rational. We're just never going to achieve perfection, just like almost anything. But the human mind is just not made to be perfectly rational. I think it's well worth pursuing improving our rationality because I think it has a lot of benefits. But even beyond that point, no, beyond intelligence, there are many aspects of being rational. One is actually is trying to figure out the truth, like we talked about before. If you're not actually trying to figure out the truth in a deep way, then your intelligence is not going to help you figure out the truth. It might actually help you justify why you think you're right, even when you're not. Right? But there's more than that. There's also skills. For example, actually being good at coming to true beliefs might involve knowledge and skills, like knowledge about how probability works, or skills about how to analyze the pros and cons of a decision, and so on. And these are not things that you necessarily going to just pick up automatically. You might actually have to have been taught them somewhere, or you have to go and learn them yourselves or train yourself.
Can you explore what are some of the reasons that we have this limitation that we can never be purely rational?
Sure. Well, first of all, we have computational limitations in our brain. Um, we only can think at a certain speed, right? Imagine that you could spend a million years thinking about everything that you think about instead of just 10 minutes or 1 hour. Um, clearly you could figure out more about what's true if you had that. But our brains work at a kind of limited speed, and we have limited time and limited attention and limited focus. And so that's already a major barrier. Second, there are certain heuristics built into our brains that are very likely there because they help survival in an evolutionary environment. So those heuristics are not bad per se, but they can sometimes lead us astray in systematic ways. A good example of this is that often when we've invested a lot in a particular project, we feel really negative feelings about viewing the project as having been wasted. And so people will often pursue these projects, continue to pursue them long past the point when the future value of them is worth it. So if you're just considering the future value, it's no longer worth pursuing the project. But we get stuck on also considering the past value, which of course, we get stuck on also considering the past investment, which of course is already lost. We've already spent it. And this is the famous sunk cost fallacy. So that's a funny thing about the way our minds work, where we tend to consider the past investment in a project, not just the future value, and it can make us behave irrationally. But there are many such funny heuristics about the way our minds work that prevent us from being as rational as we could be in theory.
Yeah, like I'm imagining some of it might have to do with you mentioned how our brains are wired is because our brains are primarily wired for survival, yeah, not for intelligence or rationality. You may do something irrational, but if it leads to higher survival probability, then you may choose irrational choice or action. Does it have to do something with that, like evolutionary link?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the way evolution works, if a species is able to propagate its genes, then that species continues. Um, or looking at the gene's eye view, the single gene perspective, if that gene is able to somehow get its host to survive and copy itself successfully, then that gene will continue to exist and spread. And so that's kind of the optimization function of evolution. It's the survival of specific genes. It's not like evolution was able to create a perfectly rational agent and then pit it against an agent with heuristics and biases and see which wins. It's more like it's evolving all the time, bottom up, and these heuristics developed because they were useful for survival. And so, we never had the opportunity to be perfectly rational. We just kind of got built from the ground up through evolution. And it's kind of remarkable that we're able to think in such a general way. But that's because of the power of the human brain that evolution created. But still, it has all these layered in heuristics that are sort of from our evolutionary past.
People often mention this concept of gut feeling. What is that? Can you explain what is gut feeling in this
Well,
context of rationality?
well, gut feeling is just a vague term to refer to a general intuitive sense we have, right? That you might be making a decision. You might have a gut feeling that you should take option A rather than option B, or you might meet a person and have a gut feeling that they're not a good person, or something like this. So it's an intuitive sense. Often it suggests that we can't really rationally explain why we feel that way. It doesn't mean that gut feelings are always wrong. Sometimes they're right, and I think it's useful to think about when is a gut feeling worth trusting and when should you kind of step back and do careful analysis instead, or in addition to, right? People sometimes think of it as either or. You go with your gut, or you're going to think about it more analytically. But the reality is often you want to combine them. You want to think about it analytically, but also consider what your gut is telling you and try to synthesize that within your sort of analytic framework.
Yeah. If I understand correctly, then combining them is useful for practical daily life. But is gut feeling something completely different than rational, as you said, like careful decision and analysis? Like, does it have something to do with emotions more than rational thinking?
Yeah, well, the way I would say it is that we have this kind of slow analytic part of our mind that Daniel Kahneman and Keith Stanovich often refer to as system two. And then we have all the rest of our mind, which is a huge rest, right? So it's like this slow analytic part and then the rest, but the rest, there's a lot to the rest. That's sometimes called system one. It's all the kind of intuitive, fast operating stuff. It's hard to even characterize what is there because there's so much there. But yes, our emotional reactions are there. Our quick predictions are there. If you say what's 1 + 1, well, you're going to immediately complete it with 2. Well, that is the fast intuitive part of your mind doing it. Whereas if you say what's 57 times 49, that's going to be the slow analytic part that gets involved. So the fast part, the system one part, there's a huge amount of our mind devoted to that. and emotions is part of it, but many other things are going on there as well. But yeah, often we would refer to everything coming out of that as our gut because it's not stuff that sort of uh, we're able to analytically inspect on. It just sort of happens without our choice of it happening.
When should we trust gut feeling over analytical thinking? I guess extreme scenario could be that, let's say you are stuck in the middle of the wild and there's a wild animal coming to you and it's like a gut feeling, okay, run away. But okay, let's just think about everyday scenarios. When should we trust gut feeling over analytical thinking?
So I have a framework I developed to help people think about this, and you can actually watch my TEDx talk about it if you want to search for that. It's called the FIRE framework, FIRE, and it's an acronym. So F stands for fast decisions. So one time when we should trust our gut is when decisions are really fast. Like you said, an animal is running at you. You don't have time for slow analytic thinking. Or another example would be if you're driving down the highway and a car swerves into your lane, you don't have time to think about it. You have to react. So you've got to go with your gut. A second kind of situation where you want to go with your gut um, are irrelevant decisions, right? The I in the FIRE framework. So the idea is it just doesn't matter very much. It's not worth investing time into. You know, if you're at the store and you're trying to decide, do I buy that candy bar or this other candy bar? It may just not be worth investing time in the decision. If you know you're going to buy one of the candy bars, you just pick whichever one your gut tells you you're going to like more. Um, then R, we have repetitious decisions. And this is the most interesting one that our gut can be trained when we have repetition with feedback. So imagine, for example, that you're shooting arrows. You do archery. If you shoot arrows at a target, but you never get to see where the arrow lands, like let's say you're blindfolded, you're never going to get good at archery, right? You could play for years and years, and you'd never get good. But if you get to see where the arrow lands, then you can make an adjustment, right? You can shoot an arrow. Oh, it was too far to the left. You make an adjustment. Okay, too far to the right. You make an adjustment. Okay, now it's near the center. And it's very much like this with decisions as well. When you're making repetitious decisions, you make the same sort of decision over and over and over again, but you get feedback on how well it goes. Your gut, if you will, your system one can learn to get better and better and better, and it can get actually phenomenally good. And a classic example of this is chess, where chess players can get amazing at going with their gut, where just their split second reaction of what move to make can be phenomenally good through repetition. And then finally, the last type is E, evolutionary decisions. There's certain things that are sort of hard coded into us through evolution that are useful heuristics that are worth following. A good example of this is if you are about to eat some food and it smells like it's off to you, just don't eat it, right? Okay, maybe there's some chance it's not going to make you sick, but it's just not worth the risk. And it's kind of hard coded in your brain to like have a gut reaction, like, oh, I shouldn't eat that, right?
Yeah, is this a thing that you mentioned about repetition, building gut, and also rational thinking? Is it the same thing that people often refer to? For example, when you do some tasks repeatedly over time, when you're doing the task, you're not thinking about it. I mean, you can do something else besides. You can multitask. Is it the same similar idea, or they're completely different?
It's related. So when you do a task many, many times, what happens is it goes from something you have to think about. Like let's imagine you're first learning to drive. When you're first learning to drive, you literally have to constantly be paying attention and really thinking about what you're doing. Like, okay, I'm approaching the light. What am I going to do? Okay, I'm going to turn left. How do I do that? Okay, I'm going to put my hand on the wheel, whatever. And then when you do it enough, it starts pushing those activities into the subconscious or into the gut. So more and more of it becomes automatic, and that frees up your brain to think about other things. Maybe now you're thinking about where you're trying to get to, your destination, or eventually you're thinking about some random thought about what you're going to do tomorrow. It's not even related to driving. And yeah, so as you practice things, they do become more subconscious. Also, if you have feedback, you tend to get better at them. So you can not only are they subconscious, but you can start trusting the output of that subconscious reaction more and more over time. So I would say it's related.
Yeah, sometimes I think about that a lot, in a sense that maybe that would be ultimate productivity tip that get good at things so goodly that you can free up your brain space to have other, let's say, prioritize other skill development. Maybe that's related to that kind of idea. Like, okay, get good at driving, so that when you're driving, you don't focus on driving too much, but maybe you can listen to a podcast, learn about skills, whatever, technology, so your brain space is uh, allowing for that.
Yeah, and a lot of times becoming an expert at a thing means practicing the sort of lower level skills until you get really good at them, and then practicing a sort of higher level skill because you no longer need to think about the lower level skill. And then when you get good at that, practicing an even higher level skill. So you're kind of building this stack of skills. A good example would be martial arts. When you're first starting off, just to throw a punch properly takes like your complete focus. And if you don't pay really close attention, you're probably not going to throw it properly. Once you kind of learn how to throw the punch properly, now you can focus maybe on a combo, right? Of like 2 different punches. And now you can think about the combo rather than the individual punches. And then once you can throw the combo properly, now you can start thinking about strategy of when when am I going to throw that combo, right? And you keep getting higher and higher level. There's always something you're focusing on, but it kind of changes as you build expertise.
Yeah, I think some scientists refer to the very similar concept called brain plasticity. Do you think this changes over time? Like if you are, let's say, 20 and versus you are 40, do you have more chance of, let's say you have a free space. Let's think about brain as a hard drive. As you get older, is it the case that you have less and less space to, upload new skills, let's say?
Well, I don't know that the hard drive is such a good metaphor for the brain because I think the brain maybe works quite a bit differently. I think the brain, for example, uses like incredible compression algorithms where hard drive you're kind of storing the file, right? Whereas the brain is always compressing everything. So let's say you have a memory from last year. It's not like all the pixels are recorded and saved and they could be pulled back up. It's more like some kind of incredible compression of like and when you go try to think about that, it actually reconstructs the event. Like maybe you don't remember the color of the walls in the room you were in, but it's going to predict what the color of the walls are and recreate it. So I think it's complex and hard to use a metaphor like that. It's certainly true that as we age, the way our brain functions changes. Obviously, when you're a child, there are many things you can't do, but children tend to learn really, really fast and effectively. They're constantly absorbing information. As you get into sort of young adulthood, that's when our brains tend to be best at sort of really fast operations. If you have to like do a reaction time test or that kind of thing. As you get older than that, our brains tend to get better and better in terms of the amount of knowledge we've stored because we just have more time to know more things. So, usually a 40-year-old will know a lot more things than a 20-year-old, right? They've just had a lot more time to absorb information. And then as we get into older age, we tend to have some, mild cognitive decline, but maybe quite mild though. And then of course, at the end of life, sometimes people have more severe cognitive decline.
Do you think there is a trade-off between being perfectly rational and living a fulfilling life? Can you make a case that sometimes it's good to be irrational intentionally?
Yeah, well, nobody's in danger of being perfectly rational, so we can put that off the side. But if you're talking about, is it good to sometimes purposely be irrational? I think it depends on how we want to define irrationality. So sometimes there's a division made between what's called epistemic rationality, which is about forming true beliefs, and instrumental rationality, which is about basically believing and acting so as to get the things that you want, right? And so if we, so I like to think in terms of values. So I have my own life philosophy that I call value-ism. Value-ism is a very simple life philosophy, but it's hard to execute, but it's simple to describe. It has 2 parts. One, figure out the things that you intrinsically value. That is the things that you value for their own sake, not as a means to an end, right? So you might value money, but do you value it intrinsically? Do you value it for its own sake? Probably not. You probably value it because it gets you other things. It can get you shelter, it can get you pleasure, it can get you safety, etc., right? So I want people to figure out the things that they value for their own sake, right? The deeper values. And then the second part of my philosophy of valueism says, go out and try to use effective methods to get the things that you value. You can read a lot more about this in my essay on valueism on my website, spencergreenberg.com, if you're interested. But from that point of view, well, one way to think about rationality in that framework is you're behaving rationally if you're instrumentally rational. In other words, if you act so as to get the things that you value, or you take actions that on average tend to produce a lot of the things that you intrinsically value. So that's one type. In that framework of rationality, I would say it's pretty much always good to be rational because it's about getting the things that you want effectively. But a lot of times when we're talking about rationality, we don't mean it in that way. We mean it more about being truth-seeking, right? Rationality in terms of acting so as to have true beliefs about the things that matter, right? In that framework of epistemic rationality, where it's about truth-seeking, there are times when being truth-seeking can get you less of the things that you value. So a good example, we mentioned this before, but let's say you were raised in a group that has certain really strong beliefs. If you come to stop believing those things, even if they're not true, it might actually harm you in the sense that it may make you less close to your loved ones. Maybe it'll even get you kicked out of your social group, right? If you're in a group of diehard, believers in some religion, for example, and then you come to, even if the religion is not true, if you come to believe the religion is not true, that might actually cause negative implications for you, right? So I would not say that truth seeking is always the best way to get the things that we value. However, I would say that it is usually a really good life strategy that helps us get the things we value. I would say much more often than not, truth seeking is a good strategy to get our values. Sometimes there are edge cases where it's not.
Mm. So you mentioned about the valueism as a life philosophy that you have developed and you are also practicing. What led you to that conclusion that this is a philosophy that's best in terms of practice if you are trying to pursue truth seeking?
Well, when I was young, I wasn't raised with a particular life philosophy or religion or anything like that. And then as I grew older, when I was about 18, I was reading Jeremy Bentham and I got really interested in utilitarianism and it really resonated with me. Utilitarianism is a philosophy that says act so as to increase the total amount of utility in the world. Utility meaning like the sum of happiness minus suffering, right? Basically create the greatest happiness and greatest reduction of suffering that you can for all conscious beings. And that really resonated with me when I read Utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham, for the first time. I was like, oh, this is what I believe. But then in college, I stopped believing in that. And the reason I stopped believing it was fundamentally, I didn't believe that there is an objective answer to what's morally good. As I considered the different arguments, I didn't find the arguments very convincing, but there's really an objective answer to that question. So then for years, I didn't have a life philosophy. Value-ism basically is what I created to replace that, saying, well, I still don't believe there's an objective answer to what's good, but that doesn't mean that you can't have a life philosophy that helps guide you. And so value-ism is my solution to that. It provides a life philosophy for what to do in life, figure out what you intrinsically value, then seek to take effective methods to create what you intrinsically value. That doesn't require an objective answer to what's good. So whether you don't think there's an objective answer or you just don't know what the objective answer is, you could still be a valueist. So to me, it sort of solves a problem. So I'm not claiming that it's objectively true. I'm not claiming that it's the best philosophy in the world or anything like that. I just find it a very useful guiding framework for how to live, and it's how I aim to live my life.
Yeah, I especially found that part interesting, what you mentioned about means to an end. Like money is not an end in itself, but a means to a happy life, comfortable life. Exercise, it's not me end in itself, but we are exercising, for example, maybe so that you can carry groceries or help someone carry things. And it's also, right now I'm also doing solo series on Aristotle's politics and the rest of ethics. I found very similarities with his understanding of the happiness. What is the purpose of the life? It has to be something that that you pursue for the sake of itself, not as a means to some other end.
Right. And I think even if you don't take the whole idea of valueism, I think the idea of an intrinsic value, so the things you value for their own sake, is a very important idea because I think people often get caught up in seeking and pursuing things that are valuable but not intrinsically valuable. And I think this is a big mistake. A classic example is someone, let's say when they're young, maybe they don't have a lot of money and they think, well, my life would be a lot better if I had more money. And they might be right. And then they start pursuing money, but then they forget the fact that they were pursuing it for like a specific goal because it would give them safety and security and comfort. And it becomes now an obsession to just pursue money. And they actually end up less happy than if they had pursued money less. So it's just very important to not get caught up in these sort of the seeking of values. You have to seek the intrinsic values. Is a much better strategy. Another thing that happens, which I think is really quite common, is people will seek things that other people find valuable instead of what their own intrinsic values are. So let's say in their social group, it's considered very, very valuable to pursue a certain thing. Or their parents think it's very valuable to pursue a certain thing. They'll start pursuing that. and end up very unfulfilled and unhappy, and they won't know why, because they'll say, look, I am producing all this value. Well, the problem is it's not their intrinsic values, it's someone else's values. A funny example of this was, I was talking to a friend of mine, this was many years ago, and she was dating someone and she was really unhappy. And she's like, I don't understand why I'm unhappy. He's such a great guy. And I was like, okay, well, let's do a little exercise. And I had her sit down and write what his great attributes were. And she wrote them down. And I said, okay, I want you to write down your intrinsic values. And she wrote those down. And he had all these great qualities, but they were completely non-overlapping with the values that she had. And then I said, okay, write down your parents' values. And she wrote them down, and they almost perfectly matched her boyfriend's. So it's like she had dated the guy that her parents had decided was the best guy, but she was really unhappy because it wasn't reflective of her own values.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, do you think there? So you mentioned about like that it has comparative part, yeah, like comparing with the others. Do you think in the 21st century, in the world of social media, this is becoming even more problematic? Like you may have your own values, but then you're opening Instagram and you're seeing someone with the fancy car, and then you're questioning your life. Okay, what am I pursuing? Whether it is worth pursuing or not. So
I think that humans have a pretty strong like mimicry instinct. So when we see other people desiring a thing, many people feel like they desire the thing too. You can see there's all kinds of trends, like, something will become really popular and then everyone will be buying them. And if you imagine you were like an alien just watching this happen, you'd be like, why on earth does everyone think they need that same water bottle? Like, it makes no sense. You know what I mean? Like, it really makes no sense. It's not because of the intrinsic qualities of the water bottle. It's really like, it's desirable because it's desirable, right? It's like, if other people stop desiring it, you wouldn't desire it either. And I think it's important to try to look for that impulse in ourselves. It's a very human, natural thing. It doesn't mean you're a bad person or anything wrong with you, but to look for that impulse that you desire things because others desire them, and then notice that in yourself and say, is that really how I want to live? Pursuing the things that other people simply because other people desire them? Or do I want to look inside myself and say, what do I fundamentally care about? What are my intrinsic values? I think it's a much better life to pursue what you intrinsically value rather than pursue what other people desire.
yeah, I guess even if you can't be perfectly rational, at least recognizing that fact to yourself that you are, you may have this tendency can be a good starting point if you want to understand your point in life, your values in life.
Yeah, a lot of times awareness is a good starting point. It's not the ending point in terms of being more rational. And I really do think there's a huge value in aiming to be more rational. We can almost all of us can benefit from that. But learning first awareness, noticing, hey, I'm doing this thing that's not totally rational is a starting point. And then you have to actually be motivated to change it. You have to have a strategy to change it. You have to put that strategy into practice. So there's a kind of a lot of steps there.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. In the discussion about rationality versus life fulfillment, yeah, this quote from Nietzsche is always stuck in my head. Like I also sent this to your note. There is this line. It says, "The falseness of a judgment is not necessarily an objection to a judgment. The question is whether it is species preserving, species advancing, humanity is advancing." So it seems like there is this point where like irrationality is something that if it leads to further development of, let's say, human species, maybe that is the something that we should desire rather than truth seeking or rationality. Can you still make that case that okay, it is good to be irrational just for the sake of future development of humanity? Let's say today we find out some fact, scientific fact, but if we try to live according to that value, we are not sure how that might affect the society and future preservation of humanity and so on.
Yeah, to be honest, I kind of hate that Nishi quote, and I'll tell you why. I think I really don't like it when people redefine words that already have a clear meaning that's accepted, and then they just try to give a new meaning to the word. I think it creates a lot of confusion. I think that's what he's doing there. And in fact, you can even see his corruptive influence on Jordan Peterson, where Jordan Peterson has used these words in the way Nietzsche does, and it's caused massive confusion and led to I think, just unhelpful, unproductive conversations. So I really don't like when people redefine a word that already has a meaning to just give it a new meaning. I think it muddies the waters. I'm not saying that what Nietzsche's talking about is not worth talking about. I think it is worth talking about, but I don't want to call it falsehood or something like that. Like, you might think of them almost as like self-undermining beliefs. Like, let's say you had a belief, but by believing it, you caused the belief to stop being believed, or by believing it, you caused, your species to go extinct or something like that, right? Then yeah, that's an interesting type of belief, but let's not call it, let's not use truth and falsehood to refer to that. Let's call it something else, like self-undermining, right? If we think about beliefs like that, I go back to value-ism here and I say, look, there are multiple things that we intrinsically value. One of our intrinsic values is the survival, for most people, is the survival of your species, and certainly your own survival. Most people also have a truth value, like they actually value truth intrinsically. It's not necessarily their number one intrinsic value, but it's one of theirs, right? And so if there were a belief that if you were to have it, it would cause it would cause your own end or the end of your species or whatever. It's not that makes the belief false. It doesn't make the belief false. It means that the belief, it might actually be true, but it means that the belief will cause destruction according to another of your values. So now we just have two values trading off each other. We've got the value of truth versus the value of survival of your species. And so we could talk about that trade-off. And is it worth it? Well, it's probably not worth believing if it's going to end your species, because you probably care about the survival of your species too much. So if there were, we wouldn't have this problem if we only had one value. If we only had one intrinsic value, we would never have these conflicts. But the reality is that most humans have many intrinsic values. We've done a bunch of research on this. You can, on our website, clearthinking.org, you can take our intrinsic values test and you can find out about your values, but you can also learn about the research that we've done on intrinsic values. And people tend to have a lot of intrinsic values. And that means that they do come in conflict with each other, right? Sometimes pursuing truth will come in conflict with some other value. Like take an example where, let's say you go to someone's show that they spent a lot of time making the show and you really thought it was terrible. Like you really didn't like it. And they come up to you after and they say, what did you think? And you see, they really want you to say that it was great. They really want you to say that you enjoyed it. And they're going to be really sad if you say you hated it, right? What do? Well, there's not a one answer to that question. It depends on your values, right? Well, how much do you value being honest versus how much do you value not hurting this person's feelings, right? So, and there is the answer to this, well, from a valueless perspective, it's just, well, you have to consider how much you value each of those things. And there's no one right answer. It's going to depend on how much you value each of them. Some people are going to value honesty more. Some are going to value not hurting their friend more, or some are going to find some balance. And maybe they're going to say, you know what, I didn't love it, but I really, I'm proud of you for all the effort you put in, or whatever. They're going to find some middle ground that's not as hurtful as saying the complete truth, but not as dishonest as, so it's, there's kind of ways to navigate through that.
Yeah, that's a good argument. But I would also maybe say it seems a bit complicated. For example, you may hurt someone's feelings in a short term, but without intention, let's say, but somehow it causes hurt feelings. But over the long term, maybe that some kind of like tough love was necessary for the person's development and maturity.
Yeah, that's a good point. And this is, I think, one reason why pursuit of truth is usually a good idea. Again, I'm not going to say in 100% of scenarios it's going to get you what you want. Sometimes it might even undermine what you want. But why I think it's a good default is because I think usually seeking the truth, it leads to a better understanding of the way the world works, which leads to better decisions in the future and getting more of what you want. If you don't understand the way the world works, you're going to make decisions in a misguided fashion, right? Imagine you're stuck in a maze and you have false beliefs about the shape of the maze. You're going to make terrible decisions of how to get out of the maze. The more accurate your beliefs are about the way the maze really is, the better you'll be able to make decisions in the maze to get out. And so I think it's like that in life. By seeking truth, we tend to have truer beliefs about the way things really are, and leads to better decisions. Now, of course, it doesn't work 100% of the time. Maybe that false belief about the way the maze was, even though it was wrong, maybe it caused you to avoid stepping on some trap and saved your life. You never know. But I think as a general life heuristic, truth seeking is a very good.
If you are finding this conversation interesting, you can subscribe on YouTube or follow on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Reviews and likes really help more people discover thoughtful discussions like this. Now let's get back to the episode. Can we also talk about the process through which the human mind goes through when updating their beliefs about something? For example, one of the things it's very common in today's times with the online social media and everything. So if you change your mind about something, like people come after you and say, hey, yesterday you were thinking this, but today you're thinking, why are you not consistent? But to the rational mind, isn't it the point that you take the information in, you update your beliefs, and then you move on?
Yeah, I think people actually overestimate to what extent someone will have a negative reaction if you change your mind. I think people are often scared that like they'll look really bad or people will think they're a hypocrite. But I think if you actually say, hey, you know what? I know I said this before, but I've thought about it and here was my reasoning. And now I actually think I was wrong. And here's what I think now. I think people actually usually have a positive reaction, which, but I don't think most people believe that, or in some level, they're scared of the negative reaction. I think what people don't like is when people change their opinion without acknowledging that there was a change. That's when it looks shady or looks hypocritical or like it looks like you're trying to pull one over, right? If I said one thing yesterday and today I say a different thing and I don't acknowledge that I was saying something different, that feels very deceptive and icky. So yeah, no, but I don't think there's anything wrong with changing your mind. In fact, that's exactly what should happen when you get new evidence. You should change your mind about things.
Yeah, but there seems to be some kind of pleasure when you, for example, correct someone and say, oh, you were saying this and now you're saying this. Like I'm thinking, does it have any evolutionary? Let's say you are part of a group in the ancient times and you are gathering around the fire. Now you are picking one person and says, look at this person. That person is not consistent. They will mess everything up. We need to do something about that person. Is there some evolutionary reason why you would first of all go after and correct people?
I don't know about an evolutionary reason, but I think there's an ego reason. I think there's a social reason. So, on the one hand, people, I think, this idea of an ego is like a useful framework for thinking about people, that we want to think of ourselves as good, as helpful, as smart, and challenges to that are painful. And so people try to protect their ego, right? So if they find out they're wrong, one thing that they might do is avoid that information or avoid accepting that information because it feels bad. It hurts them. It collapses their ego temporarily. And people who are very narcissistic, they're especially this way because it hurts them especially badly when their ego collapses. And so they're very prone to not being willing to consider alternative perspectives, not being willing to accept when they're wrong, et cetera. But I think almost everyone is like this to some degree. And so that's a barrier. There's also a social thing going on here, though. When someone corrects you, it can be basically them like gaining social status over you and like lowering your social status. Like if imagine, you say something and it's wrong and someone else observes you saying it wrong and they correct you and a crowd of people are all watching. Like they may feel that the corrector social status is raised and the person being corrected is lowered in a certain sense. And so I think that's another thing we see a lot of. People are essentially trying to raise their social status or lower other people's in a kind of competitive way. But that's not a useful truth. That's not very good for truth seeking because that's sort of a competitive game, right? Like maybe that person doing the correcting was totally incorrect. Their correction was incorrect, but they still might have gained social status and caused the other person to lose it, right? So I don't think it's a very fundamentally truth seeking game. But it is it's a status game, and it often seems like truth seeking because people are correcting each other's information or their arguments.
Is there any way to identify in social interactions to see whether someone is engaged in that competitive game of social status or whether they are genuinely trying to seek the truth? Are there any common traps or signs that we can identify?
Yeah, I think it can be helpful to switch the frame yourself. So even if the person is not in a truth seeking mode, you can sometimes get them into a truth seeking mode by making it feel very collaborative. Julia Galeff has a wonderful concept called the scout mindset, and it's contrasted with soldier mindset. So you should check out her book on this. But scout mindset is the idea that you're really like aiming to figure out the truth on a topic. Like that's the mindset you're in, just like a scout who's sort of surveying the land, trying to figure out what's true. And soldier mindset is when you're trying to win, you're trying to beat the opponent. You don't care about the truth. You're just trying to win by any means possible. And if you're talking to someone and you're trying to have a productive truth seeking conversation, the first question I think you should ask yourself really is, are they in scout or soldier mindset? And am I in scout or soldier mindset? Because until you're both in scout mindset, until you're both in the truth seeking mode, it's probably not going to be a very truth seeking conversation. So if they're in soldier mindset, they're just trying to win the argument, they're not trying to figure out the truth. Then the question is, if you want to have a productive dialogue, can you help them get into a scout mindset? And one way to do that is by trying to reduce the sense of being on opposite sides and increase the sense of a collaborative project. Like, for example, you might say, I really just want to understand this topic. Could you help me understand your perspective? I'd love to hear about it. Like that creates a more collaborative more scout mindset approach. Whereas if you say you're wrong because of X, Y, and Z, that creates more of a social mindset. Now they're going to kind of retaliate and fight back. Um, Similarly, if you might find that you're in soldier mindset, you might find that really your true motivation is just to beat them in the argument, not to figure out the truth. Well, and then that's also not going to lead to a very productive truth-seeking kind of conversation.
Yeah, interesting. Can we talk a little bit more about some of the common cognitive traps? You spend a lot of years like making research about this. Like, what are some of the most common cognitive traps or biases in reasoning that you see people fall into?
Yeah. So one of the sort of most basic rationality skills that unfortunately is way under taught and way underused is what I like to call nuanced thinking. And nuanced thinking is breaking out of binaries. So the first nuanced thinking skill is going from a black or white thinking to a probabilistic thinking. So instead of thinking that's true, that's false, or I have no opinion, going to thinking, well, how likely is that to be true? Is it 80? Am I 80% confident? Am I 90% confident? Am I 60% confident? And there's something about how the human mind works where we tend to like to work in these binaries, right? I'm not saying that we never think probabilistically. We do at times, but very often people go into this true or false mode, and it really damages your thinking a great deal because when you're just thinking in terms of true and false, first of all, what do you do when you get counter evidence, right? In a true or false framework, you either just stay true or you flip all the way to false. But that's very rarely is it enough evidence to flip you all the way to false. So you just get stuck on true. When you switch to probabilistic thinking, now you get some counter evidence and you become a little bit less confident, right? Maybe you were 95% confident, you get counter evidence, now you're 90% confident, right? It allows you to start changing your mind. That's not the only binary that humans use. We use a lot of binaries. Another one is in good and bad. We tend to think, oh, nuclear power is good or nuclear power is bad. And the antidote to that is thinking in grayscale. You're saying, okay, things have some good attributes, some bad attributes, right? Um, and nuclear power is good in these ways and bad in these ways. And maybe on net you think it's really good, or maybe on net you think it's really bad. But you have to sort of consider the pros and cons to get to the on net result. And the third type of binary thinking that we like to talk about, and we actually have a tool about this called our Nuanced Thinking tool on our website, clearthinking.org, if you want to check it out. But the third type is or is not thinking. It's you think of something, oh, it is that, or it's not that. And that can be useful at times. It's a simplification, but it can also be useful to flip into a mode of thinking instead, what are the traits of the thing? Well, it has these traits and not these traits, right? And that can be a more nuanced way of looking at it. So I think of that as one of the key skills in rational thinking that's under taught, and that many different biases come about sort of as a consequence of the binary thinking, right? So it produces lots of forms of bias.
Yeah, makes sense. Like either 0% or 100%, whether it is true, false, good or bad. Uh, y- I mean, I guess it's easier to just put into one of the categories other than engaging in probabilistic thinking, because
Yeah,
there might.
it's easier, it's simpler, it's faster, it's less effortful, it's more natural to our brain structure, but it also leads to lots and lots of problems of thinking. So
But is it because is there something to be said about uncertainty, avoiding uncertainty? Like, is it painful to avoid? Is it painful to accept like this 80%, 70% rather than 100%, 0%?
yeah, I think different people have different levels of what they call uncertainty intolerance. It's basically like how okay are you with uncertainty? How uncomfortable does it make you? Some people it really bothers them when they're uncertain. Other people are kind of like, well, that's fine. I don't really need to know the answer. Um, so it may be there's an individual variation on this. Um, but the reality, the truth is that lots and lots of things are uncertain. That's just the reality of the way the world works. And so the only way to not come to that conclusion is to, in my opinion, delude yourself. So I think there's a big cost. Believing in certainty, it comes at a big cost, which means because you have to distort the nature of reality to a very significant extent. And often the way that people remove as much uncertainty as possible is by picking one big idea and then thinking that has the answers to everything, right? Whether it's the big idea of a cult leader or the big idea of some political group or whatever. If you just say, oh, they have all the answers, then it gives you a lot of certainty, but unfortunately also tends to give you extreme inaccurate views of the way the world works.
The reason I'm a bit stuck with that uncertainty is today I received a message on Instagram. Someone asked, should we accept or should we avoid uncertainty, or cope with our uncertainty. And that's a good link that you also mentioned. That's, I think I said something like, I mean, you avoid uncertainty. Like the reason that we have built all these cities and everything, civilization, is because we want to avoid uncertainty. We want to have clarity. Where do you live? Where do you get your food? But you can't. There are some things that you can also you can't control, like prospect of nuclear war. Let's say, how do you cope with that? You just you trick your mental mind somehow. Okay, I can't control it. If you look at the past data, most likely there won't be a war, but it's still uncertain. So it's maybe 0.1% probability of chance, and there's no word reasoning of thinking about this too much.
Right. Well, imagine that you thought if there's a 1 in 1,000 chance that really bad things happen, you have to be stressed out about it, right? Well, then you either have to delude yourself into thinking nothing bad's going to happen, which you can't be sure of, or you have to be stressed out all the time. But I would say, and ideally, you can say, well, maybe there is a 1 in 1,000 chance of a really bad thing happening, but I don't have to be stressed about it because the stress doesn't actually help me. And I'm not saying that's easy. I'm someone who often worries, and so I'm not saying it's easy to do that. But I'm just saying that there is a more ideal way of dealing with things, which is like accept that there is uncertainty, accept that there is danger out there, but it doesn't mean you have to constantly be focused on the danger all the time. In fact, it's dysfunctional to constantly be focused on the 1 in 1,000 chance all the time.
Yeah, you mentioned about this is a very undertaught skill to avoiding this binary, falling into this binary categories. How can someone, let's say, could can teach themselves by themselves to avoid this cognitive
Well,
trap? What are some techniques that you
Well,
can
that's
take and
why
use?
we made this tool, Nuanced Thinking Tool, because it's about trying to teach you to do this. We also have a lot of other tools on our website, clearthinking.org, that are designed to help in different ways. For example, we have a program called Calibrate Your Judgment, where you can practice probabilistic thinking. You can practice on hundreds of examples if you want. So the reason we built these is because we didn't think there was really good resources for doing this, and it's hard to just teach it yourself on your own. So we wanted to give you sort of a interactive modules that could do it for you. So that's my best answer. If you really want to do it on your own, then I think you could try to build a habit of when you're thinking about things and you notice yourself thinking, oh, that's true, that's false. Obviously, you may not have those words. You might just think, you just kind of accept that things true or false. Trying to convert those into probabilities. Just say, oh, I'm 90% sure, I'm 95% sure, I'm 80% sure. It might feel a little silly at first. It might feel like over precision. Like, well, how do I know it's 95, not 90? But the point is, by building the habit of doing it, you actually get better at it over time. It's like repetitious action, like we were talking about before, how it trains your subconscious. As you practice assigning probabilities, you actually get better and it becomes easier and smoother, and you get feedback because you're like, oh, I was 95% confident and that thing didn't come true. Oh wow, what does that mean, right? And then you kind of you realize, oh, maybe I'm overconfident, and so you start adjusting. There's also some tools you can do to track probabilities if you want. I use one of them, and it's called Fatebook, FATEBUK, and I use it to just track things in my life when I think something might be true or not. I'll log a probability, and then I'll go find out if it's true, and I'll mark it and kind of track my accuracy. So that's a fun little game you can play.
Interesting. Can you give a little bit more examples on that? How do you personally use, if you don't mind? Like, do you
Yeah.
like decide, let's say, okay, next year there is a 20% probability of stock market crashing and 80% probability of everything goes well. So do you make your decisions based on that probability?
Yeah, so that would be an example, or you could do it for things in your life. You could be like, "Oh, what's the probability I'll get this promotion at work?" Or, "What's the probability that, I'll take a road trip this summer?" Whatever, anything that's important to you that you care about, you could log a probability for it, and it forces you to kind of think more. Just the process of assigning a probability actually forces a lot of careful thinking on the topic. And then when you see what actually happens, it gets you to rethink about it and say, I assigned a really high probability, but it didn't happen. What was kind of wrong on my reasoning? So it's a little bit of a game, but it actually is a game that's really good and healthy for improving your thinking.
Okay. If you move on to the other topic that I have here about the self-help and positivity, do you think positive thinking, is positive thinking always good? I mean, when I mean positive thinking is this idea that focus on good things all the time. Tomorrow is always going to be better. You can do it. Go ahead. This type of thinking.
Yeah, so there's multiple layers to this. The first layer is that some people claim that there's a property of the universe It's sometimes called the law of attraction, that if you focus on positive things, it causes good things to happen. Not because you go take good actions, but just because of a law of the universe. That is just unequivocally false. It's complete bullshit. You can very easily demonstrate for yourself that it's false. Try focusing on something incredibly unlikely to happen really positively at all times, and it will still not happen. So that's the first layer of like, this is total bullshit. Okay, the second layer is where you could say, well, okay, maybe that's not true, but maybe just focusing on positive things all the time will still improve your life, because maybe it'll get you to take positive actions. Maybe it'll just make you feel happier because you're thinking about good things than not bad things. And I think there's an element of truth in that. Like focusing on negative things all the time will tend to make you feel bad. Furthermore, focusing on bad things all the time may prevent you from like taking positive actions in some cases that could benefit you. So there's an element of truth in that. However, it's still dysfunctional to think about positive things all the time. Sometimes it's really important to think about negative things. If something really bad is happening in your life, it might actually be essential to grapple with a negative thing. Let's say a loved one is extremely sick, or you think about positive things all the time. Like maybe their loved one is actually dying, and this is your last chance to have a meaningful experience with them. You can't just be positive about it all the time. And that might be really difficult for them if you're really positive when they know they're dying, right? So, it's like anything, it can be a good thing, but too much of it is a bad thing. So I think there's a role for positive thinking. Like, yes, if you find yourself having lots of negative thoughts that are repetitive and they're not helping you, you're just thinking about the same negative thing all the time, then that's probably making your life worse. And you probably would be better if you found a way to shift those to more positive thoughts. But sometimes positive thinking goes too far. There's also a type of positive thinking that is delusional. It's essentially convincing yourself of falsehoods. And I think this is a very slippery slope, or a dangerous game to play, because while it might help you feel better in the moment, it might actually make your life worse in the long run. We talked about the importance of seeing things as they really are. By deluding yourself with positive thoughts that are false, you may see the reality less clearly, which causes you to make worse decisions, which make your life worse. It also can just set you up to be a less clear thinker, so that when it really matters to think clearly, you may not be able to do it. So I don't know. I think it's a mixed bag. So I like what I call positive affirmations. So, sorry, I said that wrong. What I like is what I call honest affirmations, not positive affirmations. Honest affirmations. So instead of just having like positive statements, you tell yourself like, you're an amazing person, or things are perfect as they are, which are, you could call them positive affirmations. I like honest affirmations, which are, they're affirmations that remind you of something that's true that you often forget, that's useful or valuable to remember, right? So for example, let's say you really truly believe on deep level that you're a good person, but you sometimes forget that and you feel really like you're a shitty person, right? Well, then you could have an honest affirmation of like, remember you're a good person deep down, And it's like, it's actually based on something that you really deeply believe is true, but you kind of forget it and you kind of treat yourself like you're a bad person, right? So it's about finding not just positive affirmations, but positive affirmations that are actually true also, and that it's useful to remind yourself of.
Yeah, good point. Uh, but how do we decide? Okay, honest affirmation. How do we decide the honest part there? Do we have any framework? Okay, how do we know that something is honest, rather than me thinking that it's positive? If I believe that it's honest, that means I will feel better.
Yeah, and it can be tricky. I mean, if you don't feel like you're sure you can evaluate yourself, you could ask other people, is this really a true thing? How likely is this to be true? Now that we have LLMs, we could have the LLM argue both sides, say, hey, ChatGPT, make the strongest argument on both sides. Is this true? Is this not true? And you could evaluate both sides, or you could do that exercise yourself. Make the strongest case you can that's true, make the strongest case you can that's false, and then kind of do an all considered view. So a lot of different ways to kind of approach it.
Yeah, I guess something to also add there is that before you ask ChatGPT, is like, make sure you say, ChatGPT, please be 100% honest, because it really has this tendency of sugarcoating, like confirming what you say. Hey, you're a great person. Don't worry, everything is great.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think LLMs, they can make us smarter, but they can also make us dumber, and we have to be very careful about how we use them. And the sycophantic tendencies that they have can make us really dumber by just telling us whatever we think is right, and all our ideas are good when they're not. You can actually, for many of them, you can edit the custom instructions permanently. So there's a new instruction, and I like to include in my custom instructions things like be brutally honest, tell me when I'm wrong, always give me the truth, that kind of thing, which can help. It's not perfect, but it can help. Also, it's really useful when you're asking it something to not tell it what you believe, because if you tell it what you believe, it's going to it will kind of try to make you feel good. So you can do is be like, I really want to know whether this is true. Give me the strongest arguments on either side. You'll tend to get a better answer than if you say, I believe X. Tell me why it might not be true, right? Where it might kind of soft pedal it. But if it doesn't know that you believe the thing, then it can make a stronger argument on either side.
Now that you mentioned LM, if you don't mind, I may also ask some few questions about the AI. Like, what are your general thoughts? Are you, forgive me for like doing a binary, like you said, like 0%, 100%, but are you AI doomer or are you AI optimist or are you somewhere in between? What are your thoughts?
I think that the current trends are very concerning. I think there's some chance that things go just absolutely horribly and we end our existence as a species because of AI. I think there's also some chance that it doesn't go quite that badly, but it still goes really, really badly, where maybe it puts power and control of a very small number of people who control the most powerful AIs, or otherwise, causes civilization to collapse. So I think there's a lot of really bad scenarios, and I don't think we're taking sufficient caution nearly enough. I don't think the people that are building these are taking this nearly seriously enough, even though they say things like, "Yeah, this could end the species," but there's going to be some really great companies built along the way, like, I also think it could be incredibly good. So it's one of these technologies that is really polarizing and that there can be really, really bad outcomes and really, really good outcomes. I think we're not being nearly cautious enough as a species, given the potential risks.
Can you give some examples of the scenarios that you find most convincing? The best scenario and the worst scenario?
Sure. The best scenario would be something like AI's benefits accrue to the world broadly. Like, in other words, they don't concentrate power in a few people's hands. And they allow us to do all kinds of new, incredible things that improve abundance, like create much better medicines that are more effective, have better approaches to getting people out of poverty, um, have new scientific advancements that are created through AI that enable us to do all kinds of things that solve problems in the world, right? Um, so that would be the really good scenario. And then those benefits accrue broadly because we get lucky and that's just sort of turns out to be the nature of the technology, or because regulators are able to step up their game and produce good regulation and also coordinate across countries to make sure that the benefits go to everyone. So that would be the really good scenario. And maybe it moves forward technological progress and pulls huge numbers of people out of poverty and cures lots of diseases, et cetera. Maybe it even kind of nudges us closer and closer towards a utopia on Earth, right? That's a good side. The bad side, it could be that we create AIs that are incredibly powerful and we can't control them. So literally they're out of control. Maybe they're more powerful than us. Maybe they end life on Earth. Maybe we do control them to some degree, but they still cause really, really negative consequences because they lead to an era where you never know if you can trust information, where we're all addicted to stupid stuff all the time. Or maybe they concentrate power in the hands of just a few people who now have power over the world because they have the armies of 1 billion super intelligent AIs that they control and nobody else can compete with that. So yeah, I think it could go in all these different directions. Nobody really knows what's going to happen. It's very, very concerning given the potential radically different outcomes.
Has your views on this topic been consistent or have you updated your beliefs or thoughts very recently? Because you said you find them very concerning these days.
No, my views have been pretty consistent for maybe 10 years. I will say that the technology has advanced faster than I thought it would. It's making very, very fast progress. But no, in terms of the incredible potential benefits, but also the incredible potential risks, my views have been pretty consistent. There's, of course, this also the middle possibility that it just ends up being something like the internet, like a really big deal, but like not fundamentally restructuring everything, right? So that's definitely a possibility too. I don't want to rule that out, that it could be something like, as big as the internet was. I don't really see a scenario though where it's not important at all. I don't really see a scenario where it's just some minor technology that didn't really have an effect on society.
Yeah. We talked about decisions, we talked about rationality and AI. Just a one maybe final question. Can you share an example of a belief maybe you once held strongly but later changed your mind because of the data that you received recently, maybe because of your research or new findings, and what that process has taught you?
Yeah, let me think about that. So one based on data, you're saying?
Yeah, anything, information, uh, research, or just your own understanding.
Well, I think one thing I did change my mind about is as I was learning more and more about narcissism and kind of studying that topic and reading papers on that topic, um, I think I came to believe that narcissists are quite a bit different than I thought. Like, for example, I think that narcissists are engage in altruistic seeming behavior much more often than I believed that they did. Um, and it's because I was making a mistake, which is to think that altruistic behavior is because you're altruistic. And I think actually that altruistic behavior is sometimes done for other reasons that can achieve goals. And so, for example, um, I think sometimes narcissists can seem very generous, like they can seem very giving. They can give a lot of compliments. They can even give money or presents and things like that. And I think um, what I didn't estimate properly is that the social effects of those can be very beneficial to a narcissist. So someone who wants to gain attention, wants to gain admiration, can do that through these methods. Just as an example, suppose that you really want to get compliments from someone. Well, giving compliments is a very effective way to do that. Because if you give someone a compliment, there tends to be a social expectation that you'll get a compliment back. It's also a good way to get admiration because when someone gives us compliments, we tend to like it. So I think that was like a blind spot in my understanding of narcissism that changed my perception and also made me a bit better at understanding who's more likely to be a narcissist. Because I might have previously thought, well, that person's really generous. They give a lot of compliments. They give money away to charity. They're probably not a narcissist. I think that was just wrong. I was just misunderstanding the topic. That's just what comes to mind as the first thought because it's been something that's on my mind recently.
Um, yeah, that's a good point. I'm just curious because, like, my understanding of narcissism and also how do you identify someone as narcissist is very, very limited. I'm very ignorant about this. Can you can you list out some of the traits or characteristics that you can identify someone is narcissistic?
Yeah. So first of all, we've got this sort of layperson understanding of narcissistic, which tends to be just sort of egotistical or self-centered. So that is, that's common language. But if you're thinking about a narcissist in the technical sense, in the like DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual sense, as a diagnosis, it's actually referring to narcissistic personality disorder or NPD. And the traits of someone with NPD, they tend to be grandiose. They tend to think their projects are better than everyone else's. They're destined for greatness. They have these special traits they're superior to other people. They also tend to be really admiration seeking. They want everyone to admire and love them or even worship them. Um, they tend to be manipulative and to take advantage of other people. So these are some of the traits we're talking about. And I think it's important to understand narcissists because they're around us. If you unless you're kind of a hermit, you very likely know at least one person with narcissistic personality disorder. But many people don't realize that they know someone like that, or they misattribute it. They think, oh, that person's a little bit egotistical, a little bit self-centered, is a narcissist, but they're actually not. They don't have narcissistic personality disorder, but someone else in their life might, who they don't realize because that person is maybe really good at getting admiration. Yeah, because they're sort of an expert at getting admiration because that's sort of one of their key driving factors in life.
Do we have a data point, statistics, certain percentage of population that we can say based on sampling that are really narcissistic?
It's tough because it depends where you draw the line, what's exact cutoff. But I think it's going to be something like a couple percent of the population, right? Like maybe 1 to 3%, something like that. So yeah, most people will know someone like this. But I think when you get to know people like this, they are often presenting at first a really good face forward. They might come across as a bit arrogant or like bragging because I think narcissists tend to do that. But they also might come across as really likable or even admirable. And there was a really fascinating study where they had people present themselves to a class to speak about themselves for a few minutes, and then they had people rate how much they like the person, and they also had measured the person's narcissism level. And what they found is that more narcissistic people were actually liked more when they presented themselves.
Mm.
And they even did an ablation study where they said, well, what if instead of showing a video, we remove the audio so you can see them but you can't hear them, and people still like them more. And what if they said, and then they said, well, what if we just showed a still photograph, no audio, no video? People still like them more. So narcissists tend to be good at presenting themselves in a way to be liked. right? So they're very good at sort of tricking you into thinking they're very like admirable or likable person. Not to say that they're not like it's not necessarily a trick. They might actually be a likable person. It's just that you might not realize that they have these really negative qualities underneath. Like they may, for example, be very manipulative and you don't realize it.
Thank you very much. I think this was a very great conversation. I really enjoyed the back and forth questions and answers. Like we explored a lot of things, rationality, AI, personality, and everything. Just fun final question. Where should people go and check your stuff, your tools, your podcast, and everything?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. I appreciate it. If you enjoyed this conversation, I'd love for you to check out my own podcast, Clearer Thinking with Spencer Greenberg. You can find out on any podcasting app. We also have a YouTube channel. Also, our website, clearerthinking.org. We have about 80 free tools. And you could also read all my personal essays at spencergreenberg.com. Yeah, thanks so much for having me on.
Thanks for listening to my talk with Dr. Spencer Greenberg. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on YouTube to watch the future episodes. Leave a like. Also follow the podcast on Spotify and Apple and leave a review. It helps a lot as I grow this platform. You can also stay in touch with me on Instagram at philosophy.everyday. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.